everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something today I know a lot of you guys out there are grappling with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's how to understand this constant feeling of being under attack.
Yeah.
This attack on traditional masculinity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more than just a feeling.
Right.
I mean, there are real changes happening out there
Right, exactly.
in society, and it's really impacting men's roles and expectations.
Exactly. And so we're going deep on this book. It's called Defending Against Woke Cultural Warfare.
Okay.
And it definitely comes from a certain angle, but we're here to unpack it.
Right.
You know, what are its main arguments? What are the tactics that it describes? And hopefully help you guys listening figure out this resonates with you.
Yeah, and I think even if you don't agree with all of it or even any of it, just understanding the arguments can be valuable in itself.
Right.
It's like knowing the playbook of the opposing team helps you navigate those conversations, those really complex conversations.
Oh, sure.
And really be able to defend your own beliefs better.
Okay, so let's get into it. The book makes this really bold claim right off the bat.
Okay.
That there's this war for our minds, and it's being waged by what they call the woke mob.
Mm-hmm.
And they say they're using all these tools like critical race theory and cultural Marxism to do it. So it's pretty intense, right?
Yeah, no kidding. And they really dive into how these ideas, they say, are being used as weapons, right?
Right.
To dismantle traditional values and even, the institutions that we've had for so long.
And to really drive that point home, they use some really specific examples that I bet a lot of you guys have seen in your own lives.
Oh, like what?
Things like, remember the firing of James Damore from Google?
Oh, yeah.
The backlash against Chick-fil-A. They even talk about how the definition of free speech itself is being redefined.
It's all about connecting the dots, right?
Right.
They're trying to show how all these seemingly isolated events, they're saying, are all part of this bigger pattern.
Yeah, exactly. So first things first, how does this book actually define woke
Right.
and the woke mob?
Right.
Because those terms get thrown around a lot.
Oh, yeah.
What do they actually mean by it?
So they define woke as this ideology, right? Where they think society is just like fundamentally built on systems of oppression,
Okay.
especially race and gender. And the woke mob, according to the book, are the people who are out there really aggressively enforcing that ideology.
Okay.
So they're using tactics like public shaming, boycotts, and even that term, canceling people,
Right.
to silence anyone who disagrees with them.
It's like this pressure to conform, right?
Yeah.
Even online, like in the Reddit world, people get, downvoted or banned for saying certain things.
Yeah, it's like this climate of fear they're arguing,
Right.
where people are just afraid to speak their minds because they're so scared of being ostracized or canceled, as they say.
They use the James Damore case as like the perfect example of this whole cancellation thing.
Right.
Can you remind us what happened there again?
Yeah, so Damore was that Google engineer
Right.
who wrote this memo, and he was criticizing the company's diversity policy.
Right.
And he basically said, hey, there are some biological differences between men and women.
Yeah.
And maybe, that might explain some of the gender gap that we see in tech.
Right. And it caused a huge uproar.
Huge. He was accused of being sexist,
Yeah.
right? Promoting stereotypes, and then bam, Google fired him.
Yeah.
So the book is saying this was a clear-cut case of the woke mob, silencing dissent, punishing someone just for expressing a different opinion.
And it raises that whole question of what does free speech actually mean these days?
Exactly.
Has it been redefined?
Yeah.
And, where do we draw the line? Which I know is something a lot of you guys listening are really concerned about.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they get into. They say the woke mob has redefined it
Uh-huh.
to basically mean only speech that aligns with their ideology.
Okay.
And anything that doesn't align with their ideology is labeled hate speech or harmful.
Right.
And therefore, it's okay to censor.
So they're saying it's a very narrow definition of free speech, almost Orwellian, right?
Exactly. It's about controlling that narrative.
Right.
And just silencing all those voices that disagree.
Okay, so that's kind of their take on this whole woke thing in general.
Yeah.
But they also spend a lot of time on critical race theory. What's their main critique there?
So they really zero in on that core assertion, the systemic racism.
Okay.
And while they acknowledge, racism existed in the past, they say this idea that it's baked into everything, every aspect of society today,
Right.
just isn't true. And they use things like Black economic mobility as evidence.
They bring up this pretty striking statistic about that, right?
Right.
Like 86% of black children, if they're born into the bottom income level, they rise above it.
Yeah.
Which seems to kind of go against the idea that the system is rigged.
Right, that's exactly their point. They're saying that if systemic racism was really as pervasive as critical race theory claims it is, then we just wouldn't see that kind of upward mobility.
So they're saying individual effort matters.
Yeah.
It's not all about your race.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about this concept of white fragility? It
Yeah.
comes up all the time in discussions about race these days. How does the book address that?
So they basically frame white fragility as just this like way to shut down any criticism of critical race theory.
Oh.
They say that any white person who disagrees with the idea of systemic racism, they just say, oh, they're being fragile.
Right.
And they're just refusing to acknowledge their privilege.
So instead of having an honest conversation about these really complicated issues, it's used as a way to just dismiss anyone who has a different viewpoint.
Exactly. Avoid engaging with those arguments at all.
Okay, so we've got woke, we got critical race theory. What about this cultural Marxism thing?
Yeah.
I hear that term all the time, but I'm not sure I fully get it. What's the book's take?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really interesting, especially for you guys who are interested in, the history of our institutions and things like that.
Okay.
They define cultural Marxism as this ideology that aims to, dismantle traditional values,
What?
our institutions, like family, religion, even traditional masculinity itself.
So it's not just about economics, like traditional Marxism.
It's about shifting those norms, shifting the values.
Okay.
And they're saying it's happening very deliberately.
Tie it back to the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
Right, that group of intellectuals back in the 1920s. What's the connection there?
Yeah, so they argue that the Frankfurt School, with their ideas, laid the groundwork for what we're calling cultural Marxism today.
Okay.
And they say it's a long game, These ideas have been slowly influencing society for decades.
And the book makes a really bold comparison here.
What's that?
They compare cultural Marxism to Nazism.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most provocative parts of the book. But they argue that both of these ideologies, they rely on controlling language,
Okay.
suppressing any dissent, and ultimately creating this society where only one viewpoint is allowed.
Right, yeah.
Pretty controversial, but definitely makes you think.
For sure.
Like, are there parallels in the way these different ideologies try to control the narrative and just shut down anybody who disagrees?
It definitely raises a lot of questions about how power and ideology actually function in society.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of
Yeah.
woke critical race theory, cultural Marxism. It's like a whole new vocabulary to try to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
It's like they're giving you this framework, a lens to
Yeah.
view these changes that are happening all around us.
So, where does the media and entertainment industry fit into all of this?
Yeah.
Because they're obviously a huge influence on our culture, so I'm guessing the book has some thoughts.
Oh, yeah, they definitely do. They say institutions like CNN, Disney, are actively pushing this woke agenda. Okay, what evidence do they have for that?
Well, they point to things like, biased news coverage and, the way that masculinity is portrayed in movies and shows.
Right.
They argue men are always shown as, incompetent or bumbling, even straight up villains sometimes.
That's funny you say that because I've actually noticed that myself.
Right.
There does seem to be this trend
Yeah.
of portraying men in a negative light these days.
And they connect that back to the idea that cultural Marxism, like we talked about, is trying to undermine traditional masculinity and, the traditional family structure.
So they're not just talking about individual shows. They're saying it's a much bigger trend, like a cultural narrative shift.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all pretty heavy stuff. So given all this, how does the book suggest that people resist these trends?
Yeah.
They talk about this whole red pill idea, right? What does that actually mean in this context?
So in their context, taking the red pill means waking up to what they say are the lies of the woke ideology and understanding the true nature of this war that we're talking about, this war for our mind. It's about seeing things clearly
Right.
with new clarity, challenging those narratives that are out there.
So it's like you're taking off the rose-colored glasses,
Exactly.
seeing the world for what it really is.
Seeing how those forces are shaping our culture.
Right.
And then you can choose to resist.
And they have some pretty powerful stories in the book
Yeah.
from men who say this red pill mindset has had a huge impact on their lives.
It's really interesting because I think it highlights that emotional side of this whole debate, right?
Right.
It's not just intellectual arguments.
Right.
It's how these ideas are making people feel,
Right.
especially men who feel like their values are under attack.
Yeah, it's about feeling empowered.
Right.
Like you're not just a victim. You can actually do something.
Exactly. You can take control.
So we've covered a lot of ground here in this first part of our deep dive. It's a lot to take in, and it's important to remember that this book is coming from a very particular point of view.
Definitely. Be aware of that and approach it critically.
Yeah, but even if you don't agree with everything or anything, I think just understanding the arguments and the tactics they talk about can be really useful.
Absolutely. It's about equipping yourself to navigate how complex our culture is right now.
And who knows, maybe you'll even find yourself agreeing with some of it.
Right.
It's always good to challenge our own assumptions, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So if you are interested in digging deeper into this perspective, you can find Defending Against Woke Cultural Warfare on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
It's a good one.
It's a really thought-provoking read.
Oh, yeah.
Now, before we wrap up part one, I will leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
So the book says there's this war for our minds going on, right?
Right.
But if that's true, how do we engage in that war
Right.
without resorting to the very tactics we're supposedly trying to resist?
That's a good question.
That's something to think about as we move into the next part of our deep dive.
There are a lot of nuances there. It's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
standing up for what you believe in, but also engaging in respectful dialogue.
Exactly.
So picking up where we left off, one of the things that really stuck out to me in this book is how it frames this whole this cultural clash as like this battle for control,
Right.
a struggle for power. Like it's a pretty intense way to look at it, don't you think?
It is that whole war for our minds idea.
Right.
Is really at the heart of their whole argument. And it does make you think.
It does.
It's like, are there really forces out there trying to shape the way we think and behave?
Exactly. And the book argues that the woke mob, they use some pretty sophisticated and manipulative tactics to gain that control.
Okay.
It's not just about shouting down opposing views or anything. It's
Yeah.
more insidious than that.
Okay, so let's get into some of those tactics because they get pretty specific.
Yeah, they do. One of the tactics they highlight is gaslighting.
Have you ever heard of that term before?
I have. It's one of those words that gets thrown around a lot these days, but I'm not sure I totally understand it.
Right.
What does it actually mean in this context?
So basically, it's about making someone doubt their own sanity
Okay.
or their perception of reality, like making you question what's real and what's not.
Got it.
And the book argues that the woke mob uses gaslighting to make people question their own beliefs and values,
Okay.
even when those beliefs, are based on logic or reason.
So they're trying to manipulate you into thinking that what you believe isn't true, even if it makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They give some really interesting examples of how this plays out in real life. One of the things they talk about is how the woke mob is constantly shifting the definition of words,
Yeah.
like racism or sexism.
Right.
So what might have been considered, totally acceptable language or behavior a few years ago is now suddenly labeled as hateful and bigoted.
That's a good point. It's like the rules are constantly changing. You can never really keep up. Right. And the book argues that this constant shifting of the goalposts
Right.
is a form of gaslighting because it makes people feel like they can never be sure what's right or wrong.
I can see how that would be really disorienting. It's like you're always walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do the wrong thing.
Exactly. It creates this sense of anxiety, this uncertainty.
And a fear that you're going to be labeled as something you're not.
Right. And the book argues that this creates a climate of fear and self-censorship where people are afraid to even speak their minds for fear of being attacked or ostracized.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that pressure myself, especially online,
I think a lot of people can relate to that.
where things can get really, really heated.
Exactly. And the book's point is that this self-censorship has a chilling effect on open dialogue and debate.
It's like stifling critical thinking, right? You're afraid to even question things
Exactly.
or challenge the prevailing narrative.
That's exactly their concern. They argue that this creates a situation where only one perspective is allowed and any dissent is immediately shut down.
Okay, another tactic they talk about is shaming.
Oh, yeah.
And they say the woke mob uses public shaming as like a weapon.
It's incredibly effective,
Yeah.
especially with social media.
Right.
They point to instances where people are attacked online, sometimes by thousands of people, just for expressing views that go against the woke narrative. It's like a modern day witch hunt.
It really does feel that way. Sometimes you see people getting canceled or their lives being completely turned upside down for something they said or did, even if it was years ago.
Right, and the book argues that this kind of public shaming is designed to make people conform to the woke ideology, even if they don't actually believe in it. It's about social pressure.
Yeah.
It's pressure to conform.
I think everyone has felt that on some level.
Oh, absolutely.
It's human nature to want to fit in and be accepted.
Exactly. And they argue that this is so effective because people are naturally afraid of being rejected by their social group.
Right, makes sense.
It's a powerful motivator.
So they paint a pretty bleak picture of the tactics being used in this war for our mind.
Yeah.
But they also offer some solutions, right?
They do.
This whole red pill thing is a big part of their message.
Yeah, and I think this is where the book might really resonate with a lot of men out there who are feeling disillusioned or marginalized by the current cultural climate. They argue that Taking the red pill is about waking up to the reality of what they call the woke agenda and choosing to resist it.
Okay.
It's about reclaiming your own values and beliefs and not being swayed by those prevailing narratives.
So it's about taking back control, not feeling like a victim.
Exactly. It's about empowerment. And a big part of that, according to the book, is developing a strong masculine mindset.
So it's not just about resisting woke ideas. It's about embracing a whole different way of being, a different set of values.
That's a great way to put it. The book is really advocating for a complete shift in mindset,
Okay.
a rejection of that whole woke worldview, and an embrace of more traditional values.
Like, what kind of traditional values are they talking about specifically?
Well, they talk about things like personal responsibility, hard work, stoicism, courage, and of course, traditional masculinity.
And they argue that these values are under attack by the woke ideology.
Yes, they see it as a deliberate attempt to undermine what they consider to be the foundations of a healthy society. They use some strong language to describe this. Like, they talk about men being emasculated by the woke ideology.
That's a pretty loaded term. What do they mean by that?
They argue that the woke agenda is designed to make men feel weak, insecure, ashamed of their masculinity.
Okay.
They see it as a way to control men and to undermine their traditional roles in society.
So how do they suggest that men resist this masculation? What are some concrete steps they can take?
Well, they offer a range of strategies, but one of the things they emphasize is the importance of understanding the history and philosophy behind these woke ideologies.
So it's not enough to just react emotionally. You need to equip yourself with knowledge.
Exactly. They argue that you need to understand the intellectual underpinnings of these ideas to effectively counter them.
And they recommend doing your own research, right?
Absolutely.
Not just accepting what you hear from the mainstream media or social media.
Exactly. They encourage people to read books from different perspectives, listen to podcasts like this one, and engage in conversations with people who hold different viewpoints.
Okay.
Expose yourself to diverse perspectives, even if you disagree with them.
It's about being informed and thinking critically, not just blindly following the crowd.
Exactly. They believe that critical thinking is one of the most powerful weapons against woke ideology.
You also talk a lot about the importance of community, right?
Yes.
Finding your tribe.
Absolutely. They argue that surrounding yourself with like-minded people who share your values is crucial for resisting this woke agenda.
Okay.
It's about having a support system of people who understand what you're going through and can offer encouragement and guidance.
So it's about having each other's backs, especially when you feel like you're under attack.
Right. And they suggest finding those communities in places like churches, men's groups, even online forums.
Strength in numbers, for
Yeah.
sure. Now, they also talk about taking action.
Yes.
Not just sitting back and complaining, but actually doing something to push back against this agenda. What are some of the things they recommend?
Well, they encourage people to get involved in their communities, to speak out against woke policies, to support organizations that are fighting for traditional values. It's about being proactive, not reactive.
It's about making your voice heard, not letting yourself be silenced.
Exactly. They argue that the woke movement is gaining power because people are afraid to stand up to them.
Right.
They believe it's time for people to start pushing back.
I think that resonates with a lot of people who are feeling frustrated and helpless in the face of these cultural shifts.
I agree. It's a call to action, a reminder that we don't have to just sit back and accept this agenda. We have the power to push back, to reclaim our values, and to build a better future for ourselves and our children.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership.
It's about being responsible for our own lives and for the future of our society.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to touch on another aspect of the book's argument that I found really interesting.
What's that?
It's their take on the role of religion in this whole cultural battle.
Well, that's a fascinating part of the book. They actually suggest that religion, particularly Christianity,
Okay.
can be a powerful weapon against woke ideology.
Why do they say that? What's the connection?
They argue that traditional religions, and particularly Christianity, offer a set of values and beliefs that are directly opposed to the woke agenda.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure, they talk about how religion emphasizes things like personal responsibility, family values, the importance of faith.
Okay.
They see these as foundational principles that are being eroded by the woke ideology.
So they're saying that these traditional religious values are a counterforce to the woke focus on things like victimhood and identity politics.
Exactly. They see a fundamental clash between those two worldviews.
That's interesting. So they're basically saying that religion can provide a framework for understanding the world and for resisting this woke worldview.
Precisely. They argue that religion offers a sense of meaning and purpose that can help people withstand the pressures of the woke ideology.
And they point to examples of religious individuals and institutions that have been actively pushing back against this agenda.
They do. They talk about churches that are refusing to perform same-sex marriages, religious schools that are teaching traditional values, even individual pastors who are speaking out against woke culture from the pulpit.
It's interesting because they're not saying that everyone needs to be religious to resist this agenda.
No, they acknowledge that not everyone shares those beliefs.
But they do argue that religious institutions and individuals have a key role to play in this cultural battle.
They do. They see religion as a powerful force for preserving traditional values and push back against what they see as a destructive tide.
It's a fascinating perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's something that a lot of people, even those who aren't particularly religious, can relate to this idea of needing a solid foundation, a set of values to hold on to in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and uncertain.
I agree. It's about finding something to ground you, something to believe in.
But we've covered a lot of ground in the second part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the tactics that the book describes, the solutions it proposes, and even the role of religion in this whole cultural battle.
A lot to think about.
It's a lot to process. I'm
Right.
sure our listeners have a lot to think about. But before we jump into the final part of our deep dive, I'd love to get your take on one more thing.
Okay.
The book really emphasizes this connection between the woke agenda and cultural Marxism.
Yes, that's a central theme running throughout the book.
Can you remind us again what they mean by cultural Marxism and why they see it as such a threat?
Well, they argue that cultural Marxism is all about, undermining traditional Western values, institutions, and they say the woke movement is like the modern version of that.
Okay.
But they're saying it's very deliberate, strategic, to reshape society.
So it's not just random social justice movements, it's more like a coordinated long-term thing.
Exactly. A deliberate effort to shift power dynamics and fundamentally change how society works.
And they keep bringing up the Frankfurt School, those German intellectuals from way back.
Right.
Why are they so focused on them?
Well, they see those guys, their ideas about critiquing power structures and traditional values as the foundation for what they're calling cultural Marxism today.
Okay.
Saying these ideas have been sneaking into our institutions for decades now.
So it's a slow burn, slowly eroding our values over time.
That's their argument.
Mm-hmm.
And they give examples of how it's in everything: academics, the media, entertainment, even the corporate world.
It's a pretty scary picture they paint. If they're right, and it really is a war for our mind,
Right.
what are we supposed to do about it?
That is the big question. The book has a lot of suggestions for resisting this woke agenda, but in the end, it comes down to each person, what they choose to do.
What are some things they recommend? We talked about education, community, but anything else?
They really stress that each of us, we have to stand up for what we believe in.
Okay.
Push back against this, what they call ideological. We can't just sit around hoping it goes away.
Be proactive, take control of your own life, your future.
Exactly. And they have a whole bunch of strategies for that. Starts with educating yourself,
Right.
thinking critically, questioning the stories you're being told.
Don't just believe everything you hear.
Yeah.
Do your own research. Think for yourself.
Exactly. And then it's finding your people, the ones who share your values, supporting each other.
Building those communities, those support systems.
Right. And then taking action. Get involved locally. Speak up against policies you don't like. Support organizations that match your values.
Making your voice heard, not being afraid to stand up for your beliefs.
Exactly. They say the woke movement got so strong because people were too afraid to challenge them.
Makes sense.
Time to push back. Take back control of the narrative.
Take ownership, don't be silenced. Powerful stuff.
It is. They're honest. It won't be easy.
Right.
This woke movement, it's powerful. It's got money behind it.
They believe it can be defeated.
They do. They think if enough people, wake up to what they see as the truth about this agenda
Right.
and resist it, we can turn things around. The silent majority needs to find its voice.
So it's a hopeful message, but also a call to action.
It is a reminder we have the power to shape our own future. We don't have to let the woke mob run things. It's reclaiming control, being responsible for the world we want.
Powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive,
Yeah.
it's important to step back and remember, this book, it's a specific viewpoint. It won't be for everyone.
Oh, for sure.
It's a controversial book, going to get strong reactions from both sides.
Absolutely. It's a hot topic, and they don't hold back.
But even if you disagree with some of it, or all of it, I still think there's value in understanding this perspective. It's gaining influence, got to be aware of it, even if you don't agree.
Definitely. Understanding different views, even ones you don't like, helps you sharpen your own thinking.
Right, articulate what you believe better.
Exactly.
And hey, maybe by looking at these ideas, even if they're tough to hear, it'll help you figure out what your values truly are.
Could happen. Sometimes facing ideas that challenge you, that's what makes your own convictions stronger.
So if you guys are interested in learning more about this, you can check out Defending Against Woke Cultural Warfare on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
It's a good one.
It'll make you think, maybe see the world in a new way.
Definitely worth checking out, even if in the end you don't agree with it.
Well, that's our deep dive into defending against woke cultural warfare. Hope you found it informative, something to think about.
Keep exploring these ideas, have those tough conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. That's how we understand each other and the world around us better.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.